KTTV brings you the late night report. A meeting this morning may well go down in history as one of the most important steps on the road to peace in the Mideast. Egypt and Israel are to meet at a UN checkpoint to sign a troop withdrawal agreement. The troop disengagement pact was worked out with Secretary of State Kissinger acting as a go-between. Provisions of the agreement aren't being revealed, but it's expected to take effect in about 6 weeks and involve a UN buffer zone. President Nixon got good news Thursday in foreign affairs, but bad news at home. A Lou Harris poll says his popularity is at its lowest point since his election. And the FBI is looking into what a spokesman calls the whole matter of the tapes President Nixon made of his conversation, some of which may have dealt with Watergate. Slight chance of occasional light rain, coastal and mountain areas tonight, otherwise variable clouds through Saturday, a little warmer days. Chance of rain 20% tonight, decreasing to 10% on Friday.
A second, not yet. Wait!
The Laughing Policeman, rated R.
Now playing at selected theaters, check your newspaper. KNXT, Channel 2. Now stay tuned for the Mysterious Alert, a CBS News special report. At 11 o'clock, Newsroom with Joseph Benty. The Rounders is the CBS late movie. The Late Show, The Immortal Sergeant. And on The Late Late Show, Roughshod on KNXT, Channel 2.
Story is very alert. It begins here, at the house of Frank Gerlach in Great Falls, Montana. Gerlach, who works for the Great Falls Tribune, got a call from a friend shortly after midnight last October 25th. She said an alert had been called at nearby Malmstrom Air Force Base.
I told her that it was probably just an ordinary type of alert, not to worry too much about it. And she called me back about 15 minutes to 20 minutes later and said that it wasn't a regular scheduled alert, that they were issuing rifles and weapons to the Air Force personnel, and in fact was a worldwide alert.
Gerlach called his newspaper, which checked on the story and notified the Associated Press. About the same time, United Press International got on the story when an airman in Florida was arrested for speeding to his base and explained why. An alert was on, he said. Similar incidents were happening elsewhere in the country. By 5:30 a.m., the story was on the wires. In Washington, the lid was on. No one was saying anything. What they were not saying is that all over the world, American military forces, conventional and nuclear, more than 2 million men, were being put on alert. At sea, a third aircraft carrier task force was secretly ordered to steam into the Mediterranean to join the Navy's 6th Fleet. U.S. forces all over the world, from armored tank units in Germany to bombers in Thailand to paratroopers in Georgia, all were put on alert. At noon, Dr. Kissinger, the architect of the alert, called a televised news conference to explain to the press and the public why it had been necessary to take such drastic action. But after fielding a barrage of questions for the better part of an hour and failing to satisfy the press, he pleaded for their understanding.
We have tried to give you as much information as we decently and safely and properly can under these conditions. As soon as there is a clear outcome, we will give you the full information. And after that, you will be able to judge whether the decisions were taken hastily or improperly. We will be prepared, however, and I'm certain within a week, to put the facts before you.
1 week has passed, 12 weeks have passed, and the full story of why more than 2 million men were put on conventional and nuclear alert is still a mystery. Although none of the principals would consent to be interviewed, we have reconstructed what happened during a tense moment in history.
CBS reports The Mysterious Alert with CBS News correspondents Dan Rather, Marvin Kalb, and Bob Schieffer.
An attic bedroom up under the eaves, with a place for the one thing that will make her new house a home. You made every board by hand. Isn't it nice to know that the people who moved it understand what a familiar little house can mean in a strange new one? Allied Van Lines. We move families, not just furniture.
Hang a curtain? Simple, except on those occasions when arthritis flares up with minor pain and its stiffness. For help, take Anacin. Anacin contains the pain reliever most recommended by doctors for arthritis. When even simple movement can cause pain, Anacin relieves minor pain and so its stiffness for hours. Brings more freedom of movement without pain. For hours of relief from minor arthritis pain and its stiffness, for more freedom of movement without pain, take Anacin.
This is Bob Schieffer at the Pentagon. I'm in the Army's Operations Center. This part of the center is not used except during crisis situations. During the early morning hours of October 25th, 21 of the Army's senior officers gathered here to implement the alert. Under the procedures adopted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1959, there are 5 defense readiness conditions called DEFCON for the nation's armed forces. DEFCON 5 is the normal status for military units in peacetime. DEFCON 4 is also considered normal, except that commanders step up their intelligence gathering operations. DEFCON 3 means an increase in readiness. In some commands, leaves are canceled. In others, military installations are sealed off from the public and security is increased. In effect, commanders are told, get your troops into place and stand by for additional orders. DEFCON 2 means another increase in readiness. In some cases, troops are moved from place to place. DEFCON 1 is maximum readiness. It could mean that hostilities have already begun. DEFCON 1 has never been called, but the others have on 4 occasions. May 15, 1960, the U-2 crisis. It was DEFCON 3 worldwide.
Рыло сунул американский империализм, мы ему в рыло двинули.
October 22nd to 27th, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. For nuclear forces, the highest alert ever given, DEFCON 2. All other forces, DEFCON 3, worldwide alert. May 9th, 1972, the mining of Haiphong Harbor, DEFCON 3 for all Army and Navy units in the Pacific Command. DEFCON 4, all other forces, worldwide alert. Why this nation's military forces were placed on worldwide alert, DEFCON 3, during the early morning hours of October 25th, 1973, is a story that begins with the outbreak of war in the Middle East. October 10th, 4 days after the Egyptians and Syrians launched their surprise attack against the Israelis, the Soviet Union starts replacing by air and sea vast amounts of equipment its Arab clients have lost. In the Golan Heights, the Israelis stiffen and begin pushing the Syrians back. In the Sinai, the Egyptians are still surging ahead. Men and material pour across the Suez Canal. Hundreds of tanks and 50 to 60,000 men in the Sinai. And the Russians pour in new equipment to protect a 6-year investment of billions of dollars in arms and training for the Arabs. October 15th, the United States in a counteraction moves to bolster the Israelis. A massive airlift of tanks, planes, and armament to Tel Aviv. Supplies like these Hawk missiles offloaded and rushed to the front. The stakes get higher, the 2 superpowers more deeply involved. In the Mediterranean, 2 fleets, U.S. and Soviet, are side-by-side shadowboxing. The Soviets had about 50 ships, some of their newest and most powerful. The U.S. Navy had about 30 ships in the Mediterranean, 23,000 men, more than 2,000 Marines, hundreds of planes based on 2 aircraft carriers. Before the crisis was over, both fleets had almost doubled in strength. When the Israelis, in a brilliant maneuver, punch a hole in the Egyptian lines and cross the canal, the Egyptian Third Army, stuck in the Sinai Desert, finds itself facing encirclement and possible destruction.
The Israeli dart across the canal alarms the Russians, forcing them into a rush of brinksmanship diplomacy. October 19th, Soviet Premier Kosygin completes a secret 3-day visit to Cairo. apparently convinced only the U.S. can influence the Israelis and stop the rout of the Egyptian army. Early opponents of a ceasefire, when the Arabs were winning, the Russians suddenly become ardent peacemakers. They summoned Secretary of State Kissinger to Moscow, Party Chief Brezhnev demanding an urgent ceasefire. 36 hours later, Kissinger and Brezhnev agreed to big power sponsorship of a ceasefire. The U.S. promises to stop the Israeli advance towards Cairo. In exchange, Russia promises that Egypt will finally negotiate a settlement with Israel. The Israelis feel betrayed. They needed 3 more days, they assert, to destroy the bulk of the Egyptian army. They are left with less than 24 hours. October 22nd, Kissinger stops in Jerusalem on his way from Moscow back to Washington. 5 hours in the Israeli capital, punctuated by Kissinger warnings that Russia will not allow another humiliating Arab defeat and that Israel cannot survive war after war as a small garrison state in the Middle East. Kissinger knows 3 Soviet airborne divisions have been on alert since October 6th. How real a threat, he's not really sure. Reluctantly, bitterly, Israel accepts the ceasefire but warns it must be mutual. That day at 6 p.m. New York time, Security Council Resolution 338 comes into life. The superpower call for a ceasefire to be followed by quick negotiations.
In favor, 14. Against, none. Abstentions, none. 1 delegation did not participate in the vote. Accordingly, the draft resolution is adopted.
For less than an hour, the war stops. Then the commander of the Egyptian Third Army defies Cairo's orders. He opens fire, anxious to bust out of Israel's partial encirclement. Israeli troops pounce on his violation and massively expand their lines on the canal's west bank. The Russians suspect treachery, a Kissinger double cross.
October 23rd, the Israelis hold 1,000 square miles of Egypt, have cut the Cairo-Suez lifeline, are sealing off Suez City. The Egyptian Third Army is stranded in the Sinai. The situation in Cairo is close to panic. President Sadat appeals for joint U.S.-Soviet intervention to enforce the ceasefire. The crisis now moves to Washington and Moscow.
This kitchen drain can explain a lot about sinus miseries. When closed, it blocks. But when open, it drains. When your sinuses are open, there's no congestion pain. But when sinuses close, you've got blockage, congestion, pressure, pain. You want Dristan tablets, strong medicines to open sinuses, help drain off congestion, reduce pressure, relieve pain in minutes. Dristan tablets helps drain off sinus pain fast.
1 of every 3 people suffers some symptoms of hemorrhoids. And I've found how several outstanding doctors have obtained successful results with Preparation H. In many cases, Preparation H gives prompt temporary relief from occasional pain and itching of hemorrhoidal tissues. Then Preparation H actually helps shrink swelling of hemorrhoidal tissues caused by inflammation. There's no other formula like Preparation H, and Preparation H needs no prescription. Doctor-tested Preparation H.
October 24th is the critical day. Kissinger, the pivotal man in this crisis, shuttles between the White House and the State Department. 10:15 a.m., Kissinger learns at a White House meeting that 4 more Soviet airborne divisions are placed on alert, bringing the total to almost 50,000 troops. Soviet transport planes held in ready. Special secret orders intercepted. And most important, an airborne command post is established in southern Russia. To Kissinger, a sure sign of trouble. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Kissinger talks with the president again. There is an urgent cable from Cairo. Egyptian President Sadat denounces what he calls Israeli aggression. He demands that Russia and America send their troops to the Middle East to police the ceasefire. Nixon and Kissinger quickly agree that's a bad idea. At 4:12 in the afternoon, Dobrynin arrives at the State Department to see Kissinger. Kissinger tells Dobrynin the U.S. will support still another call for a ceasefire, but opposes any call for big power troop intervention in the Middle East.
Dobrynin says he has no instructions to push such intervention. At 7 p.m., Dobrynin calls. His instructions have been changed. If the non-aligned nations propose a big power police force, Russia will support it. Kissinger expresses his extreme displeasure, warns of an escalation of the crisis. Kissinger briefs the president about the new turn, then calls Dobrynin again, urging restraint. At the UN, it's clear the Russians are not listening. They quickly support an Egyptian call for big power troop intervention. At 8 p.m., the crisis begins to boil. Dobrynin calls with a very urgent cable from Brezhnev. He reads it to Kissinger on the phone. Only later does he dispatch a copy to the White House. On an extension, a secretary listens in and takes down the exact words. Let us together, the Brezhnev note reads, urgently dispatch Soviet and American contingents to Egypt. Israel is brazenly challenging both the Soviet Union and the United States. We cannot allow arbitrariness on Israel's part. Then this Brezhnev warning. I will say it straight. If you find it impossible to act together with us in this matter, we should be faced with the necessity urgently to consider the question of taking appropriate steps unilaterally. Dobrynin tells Kissinger he requires an urgent reply. Kissinger tells Dobrynin, don't press us. There is a report from Budapest that 8 Soviet transport planes leave in the direction of Cairo.
At 11:15 p.m., October 25th, in a basement room just below here, so secret we're not allowed to film in it, a meeting of the National Security Council was held. The original impression given was that this was a full meeting of the National Security Council. It was not. Now, in crisis situations, it isn't unusual for a group somewhat smaller than the full National Security Council to advise presidents. This time, however, the group was even smaller than usual. Present were Secretary of State Kissinger, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, Chairman of the Military Joint Chiefs Admiral Thomas Moorer, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency William Colby, General Alexander Haig, Special Assistant to the President, and Major General Brent Scowcroft, who was present for note-taking. The President was not at this meeting. He stayed in his living quarters upstairs in another part of the building on the 2nd floor. Kissinger is believed to have discussed the possibility of an alert with the President sometime before the meeting. How long before is unknown. Kissinger was the man in charge of this late-night meeting. He sat at the head of the table, yellow legal pad and pen in hand, talking directly, businesslike. Haig went in and out several times. Whether Haig talked with the President at any time while the meeting was underway is not known. Shortly after the meeting began, Defense Secretary Schlesinger and Dr. Kissinger, jointly, it is said, decided to call an alert. Admiral Moorer notified the military chiefs. By about 1 a.m., the White House meeting was over. The Defense Secretary and Admiral Moorer went to the Pentagon. Kissinger, while still at the White House, drafted a reply to Brezhnev's latest note, a reply saying the United States would not allow unilateral action by the Soviet Union. Then Kissinger walked out of the White House West Wing, over to the mansion, upstairs to the President's 2nd-floor living quarters, and reported to Mr. Nixon. At this time, it is said, the President, quote, ratified, unquote, all that had been done, including the draft of a reply to Brezhnev. This was at about 3 a.m., October 25th, at least 3.5 hours after the alert had been called. What the President had been doing while the alert decision was being made and implemented, who, if anyone, he saw during that period, even whether he was awake or asleep, remains a mystery.
When Secretary of Defense Schlesinger told Admiral Moorer to put the forces on alert, the Admiral used a scrambler telephone, a telephone that cannot be wiretapped, to relay the order to the Pentagon. His call went directly to the Tank, a top-secret operations post that houses the Washington-Moscow hotline and the military's worldwide communications center. From the Tank, the coded message went by direct telephone line and teletype to every major American military command headquarters in the world. Within a half hour, Washington's senior military officers began to assemble in crisis management centers like this one, which have been set up throughout the Pentagon. At Colorado Springs, the top officers in the nation's Air Defense Command went directly to their emergency command post deep inside Cheyenne Mountain. From Omaha, Nebraska, the home of the Strategic Air Command, word of the alert was passed to the Air Force crews who manned the nuclear missiles buried in concrete silos across the northern heartland of America. SAC's famous red telephone was also used to alert the nuclear bomber forces. SAC keeps a certain percentage of its bombers and nearly all of its missiles on alert at all times. But DEFCON 3 meant that key personnel and commanders were called back to their posts and told to stand by to implement the war plans. Before the night was out, every American military unit in the world, even the Army band at Fort Myer, Virginia, was placed on DEFCON 3.
Meanwhile, back at the White House, the president has decided to send the note that Kissinger drafted to Brezhnev. Sometime after 3 a.m., Kissinger was authorized to hand to Dobrynin the note saying the United States will not stand for any unilateral Soviet action. Instead, the president proposes a UN peacekeeping unit which would exclude the major powers. 8 a.m., the president holds a breakfast meeting to brief congressional leaders on the Mideast alert. This is the first effort at consulting or informing congressional leaders. After the meeting, reporters badger the congressional leaders.
Did they tell you about the alert, though? Were you told about it at all?
Well, I think it's no more than what I've already heard on television. It's both sides.
But did you know it before it was reported on the news media?
No. Speak to the speaker, sure no. I must go, gentlemen.
Is this an effort to warn the Soviets?
Not that I know of.
At 3 p.m., in the United Nations, the Soviet Union buys the Nixon-Kissinger proposal and agrees to a UN peacekeeping force without their troops.
In the United Nations Armed Forces in the Middle East, my delegation will vote in favor of the revised draft resolution.
With this action, the crisis was over. Within the next 12 hours, the fourth worldwide alert of U.S. conventional and nuclear forces was called off. It came and went so fast, it had little impact on the public. Was it because it was so brief that the nation had little chance to worry about it? Was it because people didn't believe it, because the administration's credibility already was so low? Was it because of Watergate, the firing of Cox, followed by the Richardson-Ruckelshaus resignations only 3 days before? Skepticism was reflected in questions Dr. Kissinger was asked at a press conference shortly before the final UN decision.
As you know, there has been some line of speculation this morning that the American alert might have been prompted as much, perhaps, by American domestic requirements as by the real requirements of diplomacy in the Middle East. I wonder if you could provide some additional information on that.
Marvin, we are attempting to conduct the foreign policy of the United States with regard for what we owe, not just to the electorate, but to future generations. And it is a symptom of what is happening to our country that it could even be suggested that the United States would alert its forces for domestic reasons.
President Nixon, directing his remarks to this reporter at a press conference a day later, also sought to dispel doubts about the validity of the alert.
The events of this past week, I know, for example, in your head office in New York, some thought that it was simply a blown-up exercise. There wasn't a real crisis. I wish it had been that. It was a real crisis. It was the most difficult crisis we've had since the Cuban confrontation of 1962.
Dr. Kissinger didn't quite see it that way.
We are not talking of a missile crisis type situation. We are talking of a situation where 72 hours ago we still introduced joint resolutions, where the necessity for a joint movement towards peace is as real now as it was then.
In spite of all the explanations, the key question, precisely what justified calling a worldwide nuclear alert, still remains to be answered.
The alert that has been ordered is of a precautionary nature and is not of any major and irrevocable, it is not in any sense irrevocable. It is what seemed to be indicated by the situation. We will be prepared, however, and I'm certain within a week, to put the facts before you. There's one matter that I wanted to raise with you, ladies and gentlemen. Growing out of my last press conference, in which I promised within a week to supply the material on which or the evidence on which our decision to have go on alert was based. It was a statement that, quite frankly, I regretted having made in terms of the short deadline immediately afterwards. The reason is that as we are now moving towards peace negotiations, which we expect to conduct with the cooperation of the Soviet Union, I do not believe any useful purpose would be served if the United States recited confidential communications that had taken place and try to recreate an episode of confrontation that hopefully has been transcended.
The Middle East war did wind down. So did the American alert. But the key questions remained. Just why was the alert called? And was it necessary?
Come on, Dad, why don't you go in the house, huh?
As long as there are families in winter, there are going to be colds. That's why I have these two medicines, aspirin and Sucrets.
Aspirin for aches and fever when needed, and for fast temporary relief of minor sore throat pain, many doctors recommend medicated Sucrets.
What's wrong, Dad?
Throat hurts a little. As long as there are families in winter, aspirin and Sucrets.
I've got a secret in my refrigerator. It's there, way in back. See? An open box of Arm & Hammer baking soda. It actually absorbs food odors. Whether you have cheese, onions, broccoli, even fish, it'll keep your refrigerator sweeter, cleaner, and fresher smelling. At the end of 2 months, put in a new box and pour the old box down a drain to help make it clean smelling. Arm & Hammer baking soda. A nice little secret for your refrigerator.
A few months after the hullabaloo of the alert, Kissinger admitted privately that maybe the U.S. had overreacted. Maybe the same effect could have been achieved by alerting only special military units rather than all of them. But he and his aides insist to this day that some kind of alert was necessary to discourage a unilateral Soviet move into the Middle East. Russian diplomats insist for their part that the alert was not necessary, pointing out that in reaction, they never alerted their forces on a worldwide basis, and the hotline was never used.
The crisis presented serious problems for the American military. Senior officials here concede that the U.S. Navy would have taken heavy losses if a sea battle had developed in the Mediterranean. Among other things, U.S. intelligence believes that the Russians had 23 attack submarines trailing the big American surface ships at the peak of the crisis. But these officials, on the other hand, tend to discount the view of some critics who said the United States threatened to use its nuclear forces only because it found itself with no other real military option. These officials believe that the 82nd Airborne Division could have been moved into the Middle East before the Russians were able to get their own troops in place there in any numbers. Why then a worldwide alert? For two reasons in the view of senior defense officials. First, to underscore in the strongest terms to the Russians that the United States viewed the situation with extreme seriousness. And second, to demonstrate that the United States government was still viable, still capable of making a strong response despite the crippling effects of Watergate. The concern now among officials here is next time. How often can such a signal be used before it becomes ineffective?
Whatever the reasons for this mysterious alert, and whether it was necessary or not, it underscores some realities of the nuclear age and raises anew the question of how to improve the system of checks and balances between the leadership and the led. In this country, only a president is authorized to order use of atomic weapons in the air, underground, and under the oceans. Equipment with hydrogen bombs is at the ready, 24 hours a day, every day, all under the personal command of a president. It's not a pleasant thought, so most of us, most of the time, like not to think about it. But an American president has the power, literally, to blow up the planet. So, presumably, do leaders of the Soviet Union. No leaders in history ever have had such power or such responsibility. This is Dan Rather for CBS Reports. Good night.
Cerebral palsy shouldn't limit his horizons, not as long as you are willing to help broaden them.